Good morning. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you this morning and to be a part of this panel. And it's a great pleasure to be part of this planet. And the issue I'm going to talk about is how we can work to make it sustainable for all of humanity. At the World Bank, we have two overarching objectives: reducing and eliminating extreme poverty and creating shared prosperity in the context of sustainable development. What does that have to do with agriculture? 75% of the poor people on this planet are rural, and most are members of farm families. It's one of the tragic ironies of our time that most hungry people are farmers. So in the 21st century, agriculture has to be fundamental for reducing poverty, shared prosperity, and environmental sustainability. As we heard from Jason, we're going to have to produce a lot more food by 2050. And yes, we have to stop wasting the food we already have. And yes, we have to give better access to the hungry so they can enjoy the food we already produce, but we're going to have to produce a lot more food in the future. What are the enemies of sustainability? Extremes and volatility. You all know that global food prices have been high for several years now. But it's interesting. High food prices are good for some people, bad for others. At the World Bank, our smart economists actually don't even agree whether the long-term trend in food prices is up or down. The consensus, so I would say the majority opinion, by the way, is long-term food prices are trending upwards, but there's no disagreement about there is no agreement about that. Where there's no disagreement is about volatility. The extraordinary consensus among economists who hardly ever agree on anything is that food price volatility is here to stay. We have to stop thinking of food price shocks as shocks. It is the new normal. Short-term food price volatility is increasingly a long-term phenomenon requiring long-term solutions. Today, we live on a planet where 1 out of 8 people will go to bed hungry tonight. None of us want to live in that kind of world. Short-term food price volatility has pernicious effects on intra-household food consumption and particularly malnourishment for the most vulnerable, especially children and especially girls. So when prices go like this, it has a disproportionate immediate effect on the nutrition of the most vulnerable, and that immediate effect has long-term generational effects, because if kids don't get the nutrition they need in the first 1,000 days, they will suffer for the rest of their lives, having a generation and multi-generational effect. So what do we do? And I promise this is the last text-only slide. But people say, what should we do about it? Well, from where we sit, job one is accelerating smallholder productivity, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and especially by women. Now, we need all producers to produce more and produce sustainably. There is certainly a role for large-scale producers, but there is a huge role for smallholders, and for us, that's the highest priority. Second, we have to reduce the growing rural-urban divide, which is much a political question as it is an economic question, and setting up incentives. Because we see in a lot of countries in the developing world this growing gap between people in the cities and people in the rural areas. Remember, 75% of the world's poor are rural, and they're mostly engaged in farming. And that can have political consequences and even security consequences if that rural-urban gap isn't addressed. We need to adopt globally a climate-smart agriculture approach to get the benefits of sustainability from our agricultural investments. We also can't do it by farming alone. Now, I work in an agriculture environmental services department. I've been around agriculture my whole life. But we have to pursue multiple pathways out of poverty. Not everyone who is a farmer today is going to be a farmer in the future. My grandfather was a farmer. I'm not a farmer. I don't want to work that hard. But we certainly need to pursue these multiple pathways so we recognize that we need to have more productivity. We need to also be able to move people from the land in a sustainable way. We need to increase the quality of governance at the local, national, and global levels. In the countries where I work, governance is often used as a euphemism for corruption. Corruption is a big problem, and it has to be addressed. But governance has many other forms. How governments spend their money, the misallocation of resources. At the time of the Green Revolution, countries like India and Pakistan spent about 10–12% of their agricultural GDP on ag research and on government spending on agriculture. In sub-Saharan Africa today, it's close to 4%. So they're not spending enough on agricultural development. And when they do spend money, and when we spend money in the rich countries that many of us come from, we often spend it on the wrong things. And finally, we can't stop working when the headlines disappear. Before the so-called food price crisis of 2007–2008, there were 830 million people hungry. And that term food price crisis in 2008 has always bugged me. Yes, it's true that the number of hungry people went from 830 million to a little over 1 billion, and that was a tragedy for those additional 200 million people. But why on earth wasn't it considered a crisis when there were only 830 million people hungry? No one said this is going to be easy. We heard a lot from Jason Clay on the constraints that we have, the land and water constraints, price volatility, but increasing weather volatility that's going to be caused by climate change. And we haven't heard nearly enough about gender inequality. We waste so much because women do not have appropriate access to agricultural inputs. Our estimates are that in East Africa, agricultural productivity would go up 20–30% if women only had the same access to agricultural inputs that men have. That's an astounding amount of productivity and just human potential that's being wasted. And among the challenges, we are on track for a 4-degree world. If we do nothing, the average temperature of the globe is going to go up by 4 degrees Celsius. And many of you may be aware that there are all these debates whether the target for the world should be to increase the planet's temperature by 1 degree or 2 degrees. And there's a lot of debate about what the target should be. If we don't do a better job, we're going to have a 4-degree world, and then all bets are off. Now, it's not all gloom and doom. We have a lot of opportunities, especially technical opportunities. We have growing markets, which many of you are involved in, and that's all very good for agriculture for development, and particularly giving access of poor farmers to growing markets. There are technology innovations. I mean, this is a tremendous agricultural productivity tool. I've seen fishermen in Peru using cell phones now to get better prices for their fish by knowing which harbors to pull their fish into. I've seen women in West Africa using these to get better prices for their crops. So we are making progress. But agricultural investment is the key. 75% of the world's poor are rural. But an institution like the World Bank, we are always going to be a small player when it comes to agricultural investment. We lend about $8 billion a year. The private sector is already investing about $130 billion a year. Now that needs to rise, according to FAO, to $200 billion, but the private sector investment will always dominate the kinds of investment that institutions like mine can make. And we often forget, when we talk about the private sector, that the largest group of private sector actors in the world are the world's 700 million farmers. I mean, it's kind of weird. You think about the public sector, you think about the private sector, but too often we tend not to think of farmers as an integral part of the private sector. Now, if we do all those things, what can we expect? This is a very boring-looking graph, but it's actually quite interesting. And what it shows is that for the poorest people in a society, agricultural growth has 2 to 4 times the poverty-reducing impact of non-agricultural growth. Growth from agriculture is especially effective for poverty reduction. This is quite a robust calculation. But if the graph is too boring, you can just say agriculture growth gives more bang for the buck. I want to talk a little bit about the environment and climate change. You heard from Jason a lot about the growing resource constraints we have. But when it comes to climate change, and I say this with a heavy heart, agriculture is the biggest part of the problem. Along with associated deforestation, we do contribute about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions. But with more and better investment in agriculture and a climate-smart agriculture, we could become a big part of the solution. I mean, after all, agriculture is the only sector that can suck carbon out of the atmosphere. Other sectors can try to reduce their carbon footprint. We can actually suck carbon from the atmosphere and get a triple win of increased productivity and food security, enhanced resilience to the pernicious effects of climate change, and a better, lower carbon path. So with climate-smart agriculture, productivity up, incomes up, resilience up, vulnerability down, and emissions down. A little bit about the World Bank. We recently took to our board of directors a 5-point agriculture action plan, so you're hearing a bit firsthand. It just went to our board of directors. It has 5 pillars. Again, the first pillar is raising agricultural productivity. About 70% of our lending goes to agricultural productivity, especially for smallholders, especially for women, especially in Africa. Second, reducing risk and vulnerability. Third, linking farmers to markets, which is where you all in the private sector come in. Fourth, promoting non-farm rural income, because not everyone who's a farmer today will be a farmer tomorrow. And enhancing environmental services and sustainability, especially through a climate-smart agriculture. We've been working in agriculture for a long time, but just thought you might be interested in what we're doing a bit different in these 3 years coming forward on agriculture productivity, focusing again on climate-smart agriculture. In linking farmers to markets, much more attention to the links with the private sector. It is a World Bank Group Agriculture Action Plan, so it includes the International Finance Corporation, which is our private sector wing, and I know many of you out there have worked with IFC. Gender mainstreaming. Now, we were always rather proud of ourselves of incorporating gender aspects into the design of our projects, but there's a lot more that can be done. A nutrition focus. One of the ironies is that not nearly enough attention goes to nutrition. And it's in part, we think, because there's no ministry typically responsible. We don't have ministries in nutrition. And as a consequence, there hasn't been nearly enough attention paid to nutrition. And finally, taking a landscape approach. So we don't just think of an irrigation project or a forestry project or a livestock project in isolation, but we look at the full range of natural resources that are present when an investment is being made. As I mentioned, the World Bank Group, we've doubled our lending for agriculture over the last few years to $8 billion. We're on track to increase it again. Most of our lending goes to South Asia and Africa, again, mostly for productivity. I might mention that we're increasingly involved in the global public goods agenda. So in addition to making loans to individual countries, getting involved in global public goods like international agricultural research geared to the poor, like climate change, like trade analysis. I mean, these are global public goods that are beyond the capability of any one country or one institution to address. And certainly at the World Bank, again, we are a relatively small player compared to the private sector, so we do need partnerships. We need partnerships with other governments, we need partnerships with companies, we need partnerships with academia, we need partnerships with civil society. These are many of the partnerships that my department at the World Bank is associated with. I might mention the Global Agricultural Food Security Program, where the government of Ireland has been a very generous supporter, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research, again with the government of Ireland. And many of these increasingly are not just government-to-government partnerships or agency-agency partnerships, but also using the private sector, and we'll be hearing more about those later today. For example, the Global Food Safety Partnership, where we're working with some of the companies represented here. I want to end with 2 photographs. I call this unsustainable agriculture. It's a ruined farmhouse, and I took this photograph 2 days ago. It's from County Louth. I was driving around, and you see this house in ruins. You see the trees coming out of the walls. And this is the house where my father's grandmother was born. This is an example of unsustainable agriculture. There were 8 kids, 4 emigrated to America, and 4 stayed here. When this was being farmed by my family 120 years ago, it could not support the family. The family had to be split up. And then after I took this photograph, just on Tuesday, I turned around and took that photograph. Just had to turn around. And what that tells me is we can do it. We can take unsustainable situations and make them sustainable situations. How many times have we seen in our own families somebody turn their life around? How many times have we seen in our communities, in our countries, someone taking a bad song and making it better? We've proved we can do it. We've proved it in this country. We've proved it in our own families. So, we should be pragmatic optimists. We know we can make the world a sustainable place because we've done it. And so, if we work together in partnership, we can harness the power of sustainable agriculture to eliminate extreme poverty and stop a 4-degree world. And I thank you for your attention.